This guy really reshaped how we think about ourselves, more probably than any single person in kind of recent Western culture. If we think about that, we do things for unconscious reasons, that we have an unconscious, that we should maybe try to think behind what we're doing. If we see a therapist, it's all due in part to his work. And to understand what Freud tells us about the ego, I think it's actually important to see his particular story. Freud was born in 1856 in a small Moravian town which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what's important to know about Freud was that his father, Jacob, was around 40 years old. I think he was 41 when Freud was born. And Freud's mother was young. She was only 20. And Jacob had had a previous marriage, and had two grown sons when he met Freud's mom, and they were all living together in this small town. His father was a pretty unsuccessful wool merchant. You can kind of imagine that if he was this guy married to her, she's even prettier than her photo allows, and then these kind of grown sons around there was probably a lot of frizz-on and tension kind of in the household. Freud was the firstborn son, and he was the object of his mother's adoration. She just adored him, and she poured everything into him. And he catapulted through school. Now, at some point, I think when he was around 8 years old, the family went into bankruptcy. Jacob had to move their family to Vienna. They lived in the Jewish ghetto. He had one kind of implausible scheme after another. He was sort of domineering yet feckless at the same time. And they lived on the generosity of relatives who helped support them. But Freud was brilliant. He spoke, I think, at least 6 languages. He was just an outstanding student, had this rapacious mind, just catapulted through school, through university, through medical school. And he really wanted to be a scientist, but I think he also wanted the middle-class stability of a doctor's life, so he pursued a career in medicine. Yet even as he was pursuing his career in medicine and kind of working hard so he could win the hand of Martha Bernays, and he needed to have a respectable middle-class job in order to do this, he was still publishing papers on everything from eel genitalia, which, by the way, eel genitalia is still a big mystery. It's a weird mystery. We can't really quite locate eel genitalia. It's one of the kind of weirdest things in biology. To like cocaine, which he was an enthusiastic user of, or at least for the early part of his life. So this was a very curious, hungry mind. And then when he was 29, he was working in the hospital, practicing medicine, writing these papers, and he got an unusual opportunity. He got to go study with this guy. His name was Jean-Martin Charcot. Now, Charcot was probably one of the most famous doctors in the 19th century. He discovered a number of diseases that have his name, but what Charcot became famous for in the late 1880s and early 1890s was treating hysteria. And to understand this, we got to go back a little bit. Now, Europe was in the thralls of the Enlightenment, and you were responsible for your own thoughts, and your rational mind, your thoughts, that was who you were. That was the totality of your being. Now, the Romantics began to rebel against this, but more importantly, something else was happening. There were a lot of perfectly respectable people, particularly women from the upper middle classes, who were incapable of acting rationally. They would freeze up in catatonic stupors. They would start sobbing uncontrollably. Their behavior was just fundamentally irrational, and doctors really didn't know what to do with this, so they lumped it together under this catch-all phrase of hysteria. That was the diagnosis. And they didn't really know what caused hysteria. There are a lot of different theories. Some people even thought hysteria was due to a wandering uterus. And the uterus was sort of wandering around the female body, and then the doctors would use everything from like smelling salts to clitoral stimulation to try to bring it back into place, and that would solve the hysteria. And Charcot came along and said, no, it's not a wandering uterus. This is a mental problem. And he said, we might be able to treat this with hypnosis. Now, hypnosis had been around kind of in sort of traveling shows at this time, and he said this might actually be a useful mechanism. And he was finding success. So he was bringing hysterical patients in, and he was treating them with hypnotic suggestion. Freud studies with Charcot for a few months, says, whoa, there's a big market out there of hysterical patients, goes back to Vienna, sets up a private practice. As he's beginning to treat these patients, though, he notices a couple of key things. One of which was almost all of them has some kind of sexual trauma. They were all had some kind of sexual problem or sexual assault or abuse from typically a family member, be it a father or some other distant family member. What's more, not only was there this trauma that was ever present in this, behind these hysterical symptoms, but there seemed to be some kind of invisible mental censor that kept people from recognizing what was really going on. It was very hard for them to see, to acknowledge, or even remember the trauma as it occurred. And it wasn't so much through hypnosis, but it was sort of talking them through their stories, asking them about their early childhoods, asking them what was going on, that he began to realize that there was much more going on under the hood that he realized. And as he was doing this, he also began to realize that a lot of what he was seeing in his patients, he actually was doing within himself. That he actually had his own kind of hysterical outbursts, that he had his own shame, for example, for wanting to masturbate all the time and then feeling so guilty about doing that. And so then Freud did something which I think makes him the kind of archetypical figure of our era. He began to analyze himself. He basically began to sit down and write down in his journal all of these ideas about his own processes. And as he began to do this, he began to go deeper and deeper into his own psyche. And he realized that, maybe his dreams were representations of his own unconscious wishes. Maybe the things he felt taboo were taboo precisely because they were things that he really desired. Maybe when he made sort of slips of the tongue, the famous Freudian slips, that these actually revealed his own inner unconscious wishes. And from this, then, he began to draw out a map, which was pretty staggeringly ambitious, of what the human psyche looks like. It starts really with he would call the id. Now, when Freud was writing in German, he called this das Es, which translates literally as it. James Strachey, his translator, wanted to give it something more substance to it, so they came up with this term, the id. And as we were talking about last week, the id is this wellspring of all of our instinctual desires. When an infant is born, it doesn't see itself as differentiated from its mother. And all it wants is just satisfying its animalistic desires for pleasure, for comfort, for security, for love, for food. And that was their id. There was no differentiation between themselves and primarily their mothers. And if you think about it, think about where you come from. You come from inside of your mother. For the first 9 months of your existence, you are not really that differentiated from your mother. You're kind of like an appendage to your mother. And because of our being bipedal, and we have to give birth prematurely in order to squeeze our big brains out of the birth canal, really the first 3 months of your life, you are fundamentally dependent upon your mother or some sort of caretaker to take care of you. If you do not get that kind of nurturance, you won't survive very long. However, as we start gaining autonomy, as we begin interacting with the world, this is what we start encountering, what I said last week was the reality principle. That the world is not there necessarily to meet all of our pleasures and desires. The world presents itself to us as a set of challenges. And as we're meeting those challenges, we're beginning to develop a self-concept. We're beginning also to acquire language at this point. So we're beginning to understand, as part of this idea of me. I have a name. Now, Freud says, okay, that's all well and great. The problem is that these cognitive facilities that we're developing, these self-concepts, these rules that we're beginning to know, they're not simply strong enough to withstand the propulsive energy and power of the id. The id, remember, is our life force. It's got billions of years of evolution that's kind of fueling it. It wants to go out, it wants to dominate, it wants to have pleasure, it wants to sort of take whatever resource it can and gobble it all up for itself. It's just this wellspring of animalistic desire. And on top of this is this kind of fragile little ego. And I like to think about this as, imagine the id like a rock band from the 1970s. Let's call them Led Zeppelin. And the rock band wants to just go out and trash hotel rooms and take lots of drugs and sleep with whomever they can, and they just don't care about the consequences. And the ego is like the band manager. And the band manager's like, okay, we got to get to the next tour. You're due on stage in 20 minutes. And they're trying to cajole and negotiate and try to get the band to sort of do all this before the tour comes collapsing down. And the band's just like, rah, 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 rah. And so what does the psyche do in this? It's facing this catastrophic consequence. And Freud says, the psyche basically engages in a bit of psychological jujitsu. It takes all of the aggression and energy that was coming from the id, all of that dynamic vitality, and it redirects it towards itself. And it takes the form of a superego. And what the superego is basically like a mental policeman. Or with the analogy of the band, it's like a burly, kind of beefy security guard that the manager hires to kind of beat the band up and keep it in line. The reason, as we were talking about last week, that we feel perpetual feelings of guilt or anxiety, this is the superego at work. When we have a desire that's socially unacceptable, when we have a desire that's going to be incompatible with our survival needs, the superego steps in and counters that desire by generating feelings of anxiety, guilt, depression, all of our neuroses that we were talking about last week. All of these feelings that we have that keep us in line, the way that we internalize civilization, and it gets crystallized, what Freud said, in the form of the superego. Now, here's the challenge for us. Most of the time, if we go up to our level of consciousness, all we see in our conscious minds is the ego. When we think about ourselves, we typically think about our ego, our identities, our names, our life stories. That's what we know of ourselves. Most of the id and most of the superego lies well below the level of our consciousness. This is the famous iceberg model. We don't really see the superego at work. What we just do is feel its consequences. I don't see what's triggering my feeling of anxiety or guilt. All I know is I feel the anxiety or guilt. Or more importantly, I feel the anxiety and guilt, and then I start looking around for excuses or stories to rationalize that feeling. I'm probably not seeing its original origin. He said he saw this with hysterical patients. They would freeze up, they would get some sort of an association with something. Like, so for example, they might see a man with a brown hat, and the brown hat would just terrify them, and they would start freaking out. And they were just like, I have brown hat phobia. But what was probably going on is, if you go back and you look at their life history, they might have had a traumatic encounter with a man with a brown hat, and a brown hat always triggers that, or they saw a brown hat when this was happening. And so he said, if we really want to know what's happening here, we've got to go beneath this. We've got to understand the stories that are happening behind this whole edifice that's here. And Freud then said there is one primary story that really explains this, and this is the Oedipal Complex. If we really want to understand why the ego develops and why the superego develops, it has to do with this erotic dynamic between your parents. And the way he described this erotic dynamic was with the myth of Oedipus. And as you all probably know, the myth of Oedipus, Oedipus was a child. He was the son of the king of Thebes. The king gets a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi saying, your son will kill you and marry your wife. And he's like, I don't want that. So he takes the son and he takes him out to a mountaintop to be exposed. And that's how they killed children back in those days. It was not uncommon. The baby's out there, young Oedipus is like, wah! A shepherd finds him and takes him to a nearby kingdom in Corinth. And the king adopts him, raises him on his own. He also hears the prophecy, and Oedipus hears the prophecy and says, okay, I've got to leave this kingdom and go on the road. On the road, he meets his biological father, inadvertently kills him, and then comes into and makes his way to Thebes. Thebes is now under the dominance of the Sphinx, who's causing all kinds of mayhem for the city. Oedipus goes out, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, comes back, he's made king. He marries Jocasta, his mother, and has children with his mother. Later, he realizes this. The prophecy unfolds, and he's so tormented by what he has done, the fact that he has killed his father and had sex with his mother, that he blinds himself, and he spends the rest of his days kind of wandering about in this blind, guilt-ridden lament. And that's the tragedy of Oedipus. And we can see this story, according to Freud, this is something that's really, really common across human narrative. We can see it, for example, in Hamlet. One way of reading Hamlet is like an Oedipal drama retold. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Back to the Future, this movie from the 80s. This is a total Oedipal drama. I'm gonna go back in time, and my mommy really likes me, but I have this weak, feckless father, and I'm gonna put him forward and empower him. You could see this in erotic fantasies. Daddy issues or MILFs or these types of things. And Freud says, we have these erotic attachments towards our parents and we don't want to acknowledge them. And they're erotic attachments that are natural. They form when we are children. They're not sexual in the way that we oftentimes think of sexual. They're more what he said were polymorphous, perverse inclinations. They were just sort of our vitality being attached onto our parents. And at some point, we realize that we can't have that. And so we have to repress it. Because those desires are so threatening to us. They threaten us with catastrophic destruction from our fathers. And we've got to figure out a way around them. And so that was the Oedipal drama, and that's the Oedipal complex. And it's sort of at the heart of Freudian psychoanalysis. And so if you go and you look, like, for example, once Freud became popular, if you look in the mid-20th century in American or European culture, there's just this preoccupation with the Oedipal complex. And Freud himself was very orthodox about this. He said this was the defining story of humanity. But we go back and we look at Freud's story, and there's a lot of problems with the Oedipal complex. It doesn't really even deal with sort of female psychological development. It's a very male-centered orientation. We can list a lot of critiques, but I think the most important one is, remember, Freud went into his own self-analysis to come up with this. And you kind of help wonder, is this the universal human story, or is this simply the story of Freud himself? His own ambivalence towards his feckless father and his kind of attractive mother. But what we want to do when we come away from this, I think what we can borrow from Freud is still really important. We don't need to throw Freud out just because of the rigidity of the Oedipal complex or his particular theorizing. And I think the more important thing we do with Freud is understand this idea of ego. That we have these psychological processes that are in relationship to each other, and they're the means that we are understanding our relationship with other people, and more importantly, they're the mechanisms by which we are trying to advocate for ourselves. They are part of our self processes, the ways that our life force is negotiating with reality. It's primarily informed by our early childhood experiences. The way we understand ourselves in the world is first and foremost determined by our experiences growing up, and particularly with our parents. This is what's imprinting on us, and it's imprinting on us both very, very deeply and very strongly, and mostly unconsciously. We're not really aware. We don't have memories probably of our lives, we don't have very strong memories of our lives going back from age 6, earlier. It's only in recent times that we understand our stories, but those first 5 or 6 years are deeply, deeply imprinting upon us. The way that we know this primarily is by then going in and thinking about our stories. And I think this is probably Freud's biggest contribution, is the idea of therapy. That if you really want to know your ego, you've got to kind of go and excavate your stories. And you could do this in any number of ways. Freud did it for himself by kind of writing down in journals. But most of the time that we do this is by seeing a therapist. So the therapist sits with us, we sit down, and we begin to say, well, what was your mom like? What was your dad like? And we begin to understand our problems, and we can understand our problems through these early narratives, and we dig into them, and we dig into them, and we dig into them. And this leads us to the other thinker that I really want to talk about today, who I think, like Freud, is really someone who focuses on our stories and can help us interpret our stories, and this is this guy, Carl Jung. How many of you know anything about Jung? Curious. A couple of you. How many of you have taken your Myers-Briggs personality inventory? Most of you. This is Jung, or this is, I should say, is an appropriation of Jung. And ironically, I think this is actually how most people encounter Jung these days. But if you've gone into therapy, and particularly if you've gone into Jungian therapy, or if you go into like a New Age bookstore, you're more, or if you like have had any exposure to Jordan Peterson, you may be encountering Jung in kind of a deeper way. I think Jung is important for us because, like Freud, he's made a huge, huge impact on Western culture in terms of how we think of ourselves. If you've ever called yourself an introvert or an extrovert, that's due to Jung. If you think about the term of archetypes or shadow self, that's due to Jung. So he was also an incredibly influential thinker, a somewhat problematic thinker, as we'll see, and a really important one. And I think the way to understand Jung is sort of in comparison with Freud here. So when Jung started off, there's an interesting parallel between his life and Freud. Like Freud, he grew up in a small rural town. He pursued a career in medicine. He then came under the influence of an elder mentor who reshaped his thinking. Only in the case of Jung, it was Freud himself. Jung was practicing medicine. He came across Freud's writings. He said, this guy has something I want to know. And he wrote to Freud, and the two of them hit it off immediately like gangbusters. Evidently, their first conversation went on for like 13 hours. And soon Jung became Freud's primary kind of acolyte. You know, if we could think about Freud as sort of the prophet of the unconscious mind, Jung at first was probably his primary disciple. And the two of them, for example, established psychoanalytic theory here in the United States. But as they began working together, Jung started bristling at Freud's narrow characterizations. He wasn't as preoccupied with sexual repression and the repression of all these energies that Freud was. He didn't buy into the Oedipal myth as the primary way of understanding our psychological composition. And what Jung began to offer instead, I think, was a much more nuanced and open way of understanding our psyche. And I think a good way of understanding Jung is to go back and look at the Alison Bechdel book. And what Jung says is that if we want to know ourselves and we want to know where our stories are coming from, oftentimes they are created by what he just called general complexes. And complexes can take any number of forms and can take any number of incarnations, but they're indelibly stamped with our early childhood experiences. And the reason I assigned the Bechdel book this week, because I think she does just such an amazing job in this book of elucidating her early childhood and bringing about sort of various dynamics. So she's trying to figure out who she is, and she's realizing a lot of her own struggles and her own journeys to come to terms with her sexuality and her own sense of place in the world has to do with this very complex relationship with her father, you know, who, as we see in the book, starts off the book, has died. And the circumstances of his death, where it was an accident or a suicide, are really, really unclear. And as she's going back and thinking about this, she's starting to think about the dynamics of her relationship with her dad. Because on the one hand, he's remote, he seems to be caught up in his own issues, he's oftentimes neglectful, but then there are these moments of real connection, and she, of course, relates to her father in a very strong way. The two of them are very, very similar in a lot of their inclinations. And what I like is she invokes a lot of mythic image in doing this. So she talks a lot about sort of, for example, Greek mythology and literature. There are these really wonderful moments in the book where she's talking about the ambivalence she has about her own intimate relationship with her father. It's not necessarily erotic in the way that Freud might suggest. It's more just about wanting some kind of intimacy. And so this scene, you know, where she's going up and she's kissing her father's hand goodnight because she doesn't know how else to relate to him. I mean, just how sort of painful and poignant and awkward that is, and how that epitomizes, I think, a lot of this sort of, you know, tumult around her own understanding of how she relates to her father. Her father as this figure who would have these kind of periodic violent outbursts, for example, and how like destabilizing that was and how scary that was for her as a child. Yet, you know, that could also then be followed up on the bottom of the page with him being very tender and loving on occasion too. And so getting all of these mixed signals from this father figure that she reveres so deeply, and then how it expresses itself in its later ambivalence. So when she comes to the point where, you know, she's gone back from college to her father's funeral and she sees her brother, and she starts smiling at each other and kind of giggling. And partly that's sort of the release of all of this tension, but it expresses all the deep ambivalence that she's experiencing in relationship to this father figure who died. And so I think what Jung offers us is a way of maybe interpreting this story that's not so straitjacketed by Freud's kind of narrow preoccupation with a particular Oedipal drama. And to see this, let's look at Jung's model of the psyche. Now, Jung is a more difficult thinker to understand than Freud. Whereas Freud tried to be very scientific and very clear, and Freud was a great writer, Jung was not preoccupied with that. He was much more interested in kind of, I think, our mythic and spiritual potentials than necessarily an attempt to be kind of systematic, rigorous, and scientific. And so when we're trying to parse out Jung's model of the psyche to the extent that it exists, we have to kind of reconstruct it ourselves. It's not something that lends itself to kind of an easy extrapolation. What people have basically done, they take this one drawing from a Jung lecture and they said, if you try to understand Jung's model of the psyche, if we think about Freud's model of the psyche as this iceberg with, you know, id, ego, and superego that's there in this sort of layer of consciousness, Jung has a different conception. First, he has this idea of the self, which is at the center of all of this. And the self is negotiating with the outside world through an ego. So he shares that basically with Freud. And that's what we sort of see as our consciousness here. But there are other elements here that Freud doesn't mention that he brings up. And I think one of the best contributions that Jung makes for us is this idea of persona. And persona is a Latin term, and it was initially used to refer to the mask that Etruscan mimes wore during the Roman Empire when they would do performances. And their persona were literally these faces that they would present to the crowd. And Jung uses this term very, very artfully here. He basically says that the ego is not simply one encapsulated thing. It's a dynamic process of different personae that are being utilized depending on our circumstance. And so we oftentimes then rely on these personae in any given moment. So like right now, I am inhabiting the persona of the authoritative, wise, knowledgeable professor. And I've got my, professor costume on, and I'm speaking in my professor voice, and I'm relating to you vis-a-vis this professor persona. And this is not the persona that I use, say for example, when I'm at home with my kids. They will gladly tell you that. And we all do that. We all have these different masks that we put on. For example, it's the good child persona, where we're there and we're eager to please our parents. We want to get their adoration. We want their we want to make sure that we're doing everything right. We want our rewards. And so we do that. We work hard at school and we show, look, I got good grades. And they're like, oh, you're such a good kid. And that, that rewards us. That's an ego dynamic that's at play. And we adopt to that and we hold on to that. Or maybe we're in a different circumstance where our parents aren't around and we're into a status persona. So you go to your school and you're in this group or you're in this clique or you're doing this activity and you're signaling some kind of status orientation there. I'm a popular person, I'm a nerdy person, I'm any number of personae that might fit in some kind of hierarchy. Gender is a huge persona. We adopt sort of norms of gender and we demonstrate them performatively in order to fit in. I see this with my son. He's 14 and he was always a sort of awkward, nerdy kid when he was in elementary school. And a couple of years ago he started playing basketball, and then that kind of gave him entry into the popular crowd. And so he's with all of these kind of bro-y athletic boys. And I notice he's this kind of very sweet, sensitive kid, but when I see him around all these other boys, he does all this like performative, yo dude, yo dog, what's up? They kind of do this whole play acting around the sort of gender persona as a way, I think, of feeling secure and understanding and relating to one another here. And this leads Jung to, I think, another really important way of thinking about ourselves. And this is the shadow self. And this is a concept that you might have encountered. And I think this is a really, really interesting one for us. And what Jung basically says is that, yes, we have all of these personae. We may acknowledge them and we may have some distance with them at times and we can sort of see through them. But we swap them, and most of the times we swap them pretty unconsciously and we just fully inhabit them. But there's parts of ourselves that are not parts that we want to publicly display to the world. And he said this is our shadow self. And oftentimes it represents the kind of desires that are not socially acceptable or that we don't want to acknowledge. It's that desire to sleep with your roommate's boyfriend, or to cheat on the test, or to do something that's socially unacceptable. And it doesn't always have to be necessarily dark or antisocial. A couple of weeks ago I was talking about music and how during COVID I started playing piano, and my wife was saying, why are you playing such sad songs? And I'm normally a pretty cheery person. I think that's my kind of public persona, and I kind of tell myself to be cheery. But maybe I was playing sad songs not because they were slow and easy to play, but because there's a shadow part of myself that's just kind of sad. And the sad songs are the way they come out. And what Jung says is that our shadow selves oftentimes come out in various forms. And if we want to understand and fully inhabit this essence, and he called this individuation, this was his term for it. If we want to get in touch with this, we've got to see through all the persona and the shadow selves, and we've got to come to terms with this. Now, if he had just sort of stopped there, Jung might be more kind of widely accepted. But Jung took this another step further. And depending on who you ask, this either made him a mystical visionary or kind of a crackpot. And it's probably the reason why we don't see Jung more widely embraced in academia is because of this, because he's actually moving away from science here. He's moving into this mysticism, and he does this with the idea of the unconscious. Now, Jung says, like Freud, he says there's a big part of our psyche that's unconscious to us, and a lot of that is what he would call the personal unconscious. It comes from our individual life stories. It's the way that we relate to the world. But there's also something else there. Jung says there's this thing called the collective unconscious. And it's something that we share across all of humanity, that is informed by all of human history. And this collective unconscious is this sort of amorphous form that's out there, but it kind of manifests itself in these archetypes. He's very slippery on what an archetype is. It's basically, he says, it's unspecific knowledge from human history. So it's this well of a potential that's there. It's not necessarily a distinct image or a distinct idea. It's the potential for an image or an idea to become manifest in certain circumstances. So it's already kind of fuzzy in his formulation. When he says it's out there, there's this energy, this collective unconscious, and it links us to all of human past. And the way that we can see it expressing itself is through these archetypes. And so if you go around and you look at different human cultures, you see the same kind of archetype figures emerging again and again and again. So a few years ago, I was able to go to a Hopi bean dance. It's an initiation ceremony in the Hopi reservation. And they had these Kachinka figures who come out and do these ceremonial expressions here. And these are classic Jungian archetypes. Like there's the jester, the trickster that's doing something there. There's Crow Mother who's out there kind of, fertilizing the fields. And Jung would say these are representations of this kind of collective human unconscious. And he names some of these even more specifically. So he had this idea of anima and animus. The idea that there are these kind of gendered archetypes that are throughout human history here. And that each of us holds these archetypes within us. That yes, we may emphasize one archetype more strongly, and we may identify with one archetype more strongly, like being in a classical male or female propensity. But these are like yin and yang. We have both archetypes within us. And we need to acknowledge both of them as part of our own dynamic life force here. There's also the archetype of the self, the idea of this wholeness, of coming to sort of spiritual transformation, of kind of greater full realization here. The problem, I think, with archetypes is both we don't really know what they are because they're unspecified knowledge here. And what that means is that people oftentimes create archetypes to be anything that they want. So if you go into like a New Age bookstore, you'll oftentimes say, oh, it's a Jungian archetype. And so you'll see something like, the tarot. And these represents, these truths. And they make truth claims based on, these are archetypes that go back all the way through human history. And people create these belief systems and these mechanisms of self-knowledge based on this appropriation of Jung and Jung's mysticism. And say, this is essential. And these become ways that people interpret their own stories. So in that way, maybe they have validity for people. They become the interpretive framework by which they're understanding their egos. But it becomes a little slippery there because are we talking about something real or are we talking about something made up? And does it matter? One person I think who can help us think through this, and I think has made a really good contribution, is this guy, who you may or may not be familiar with. His name is Joseph Campbell. He was an anthropologist and kind of a student and scholar of myth and comparative mythology. And he was also a big Jung acolyte. He was very, very influenced by Jung. And he made probably a really important contribution for understanding how stories work with us. And his idea was the monomyth, or what's also known as the hero's journey. And what Campbell basically says is if you go across all human cultures, you find this archetype of the monomyth, which is the same kind of story that plays out again and again and again. And we can see it in all of our cultural stories here. All of the stories that you grew up with encapsulate this monomyth in some ways. And they could come from religious traditions, they could come from popular culture. And the hero's journey is basically this period of going out, of finding exploration, finding mentors, finding allies, confronting your shadow self, confronting all that's kind of difficult that's out there within you, having some moment of transcendence, of letting go, and then reaggregating back into a more fully realized version of yourself. And let me give you an example of this. We'll take through this. Probably something that you're all familiar with, Harry Potter. So Harry Potter is a classic monomyth, hero's journey. When it starts off, Harry is there, he's living under the stairs, and he's miserable. He has this mundane, humdrum life, and he suspects that there's something more to life. And there are things happening to suggest that maybe he's more than what meets the eye. I mean, he can talk to snakes. And sure enough, then comes the call to adventure. He gets the invitation to go attend the School of Wizardry at Hogwarts. That starts him on his journey. It starts him on his journey out of the ordinary. Along the way then, and what this is common to all of these archetypes, is typically the hero meets somebody who's the wise mentor. And the wise mentor oftentimes gives them a piece of secret knowledge or gives them some sort of artifact or tool to help them. Gives them the magic sword, the wand, the ruby slippers. Something to kind of to pull them forward on their journey. So they go to the next step and they enter the unknown. They start going outside of their normal frame of reference. They start thinking about the world in a new way. And along the way, certain things happen. They start confronting challenges. They start fighting monsters. They start solving riddles. Typically, they enlist allies. They make friends. They collect people along with them. And then finally, this leads to the ultimate confrontation with their primary nemesis. And in that confrontation with the primary nemesis, oftentimes in the hero moment, there's some moment of death and rebirth. They let go of their humdrum ordinary life. This is the notion of ego dissolution here, where this false self, the self that's defined entirely by these personae, by these old stories, gives way. We let go of these old ways of defining ourselves, and we begin to move forward to a true self. And once we do this, we discover new powers. And with these new powers, we're able to fully vanquish all of our nemesis and enemies that are out there. We've gone into the dark cave. We've gone to the castle, the witch's castle. We've gone into the darkest place. We've defeated our enemy. Now we come back out, and the final stage of the hero's journey is the return home. Here we are re-aggregating. We are now what Jung would call individuating. We've cast aside our old ways of being. We've learned new ways of being, and the new ways of being are more authentic to who we are in our true self. So that's a very powerful narrative, and it has a lot of appeal. I mean, who among you doesn't feel in some ways that there's something more than this kind of mundane, humdrum life? I mean, the fact that you even came here to the University of Chicago, yes, you're meeting somebody's expectations, but it takes bravery. That's your call to adventure. You're stepping out of the ordinary. You're here. You're being confronted with all kinds of new challenges. You're also in a council. You're making friends. You're making allies. And hopefully, you taking this class is even part of that. So what I want to do is I want you to think about what your hero's journey is. And as your wise mentor that's here, I feel it's incumbent upon me to give you some kind of magic totem, some kind of item to help you on your journey. Baka Samuel Jita are going to hand out magic bracelets. So you can take these magic bracelets. You could do with them what you want, but they're a magic bracelet. And this will help you in the weeks ahead as you're in this class thinking about yourself. As you delve and explore more deeply into yourself, you can put this on, and I suggest by wearing this, it's going to give you some assistance in this journey of self-exploration.